You need to make decisions throughout your life, and these decisions may not always be right and favorable for life. I was supposed to get married, and if ever a harsh statement was made, that's it, right? Well, it takes two to tango, I suppose. So it would be more accurate to say that Maddie and I both had to get married. Otherwise, it would have been a bit lonely standing up there alone. Even that's a bit blunt, and only half the truth. If we hadn't wanted to get married anyway, it simply wouldn't have happened. One fine Friday evening, my regular girlfriend for the past year, Maddie, said to me, "James, I've got some news for you." "Good news or bad?" I asked with a smile, taking in my stunningly attractive, slim, blonde girlfriend who was around 5'6". "Not sure, James," Maddie replied nervously with a grin. "It could be either. It really depends on you." You can guess where the conversation was headed. A short time later, we were in each other's arms, professing our love and discussing when I would make my newly pregnant girlfriend my wife. "Anytime that works for your family," Maddie suggested. "I don't have much family left, now that Auntie Beth has passed away, and I'm not particularly close to anyone in Leicester anymore." It was true. Sad, but true. Poor Maddie had lost both her parents in a motorcycle accident as a child. After some early fostering, she had been raised by Auntie Beth, a longtime friend of her late mother, just outside Leeds. Auntie Beth had passed away a few weeks before I even had a chance to meet her. I was in Canada on business when she died, and by the time I got back, Maddie had already gone to Leeds for the funeral, and everything was settled. Quite literally. "What about Beth's son, Maddie?" I asked, somewhat hesitantly, knowing that the topic had previously been cut short. "You used to be close to Tom, didn't you? Wouldn't you want him there on the day?" "Tom's in prison, James," Maddie replied sharply, her irritation evident. "I've told you before, I don't want to talk about him." Oops. I should have known better than to bring up Tom. I knew he was serving time, but I didn't know the details. Touchy subject. Better change the topic quickly. My parents are retired, so any date should work for them. "The sooner the better, then," Maddie said with a smile, patting her still flat tummy and her anger forgotten. "Let's call them now." And so, it was decided. Just 4 weeks later, we were married at the registry office in Bedford, where we were living, with a small group of my family and our mutual friends in attendance. We then went on a wonderful honeymoon to the West Indies. However, it wasn't until several weeks after our return that Maddie's belly began to show signs of our first child's arrival. Beth. That's what we named the little bundle of joy who eventually arrived, screaming into the world with a full set of fingers, toes, and a pair of lungs that promised a few sleepless nights. Since my mum's name was too lengthy and outdated, we chose to name our daughter after the woman Maddie had considered a mother. I thought it was fitting, and Maddie appreciated the gesture. Married life was wonderful, and although we had our disagreements from time to time, Maddie and I settled into a happy routine with our adorable baby daughter. Beth, as she grew up, had a distinct blonde hair color with a hint of ginger in the right light. In contrast to my dark complexion and jet black hair, Maddie had a dirty blonde shade, so Beth's appearance favored her side of the family. However, Beth inherited my calm demeanor, rarely getting upset or crying, while Maddie, being naturally more emotional, was quite different in that regard. It seemed like a good blend of traits from both of us, though I never had the courage to mention this to my beloved wife. We had been married for nearly 4 years, and Beth had just celebrated her 3rd birthday when things suddenly became unsettling in the Dawson household. Beth was her usual cheerful self, and I was content with life, but Maddie seemed preoccupied. She had left her job shortly before Beth was born and, given that I was earning well, she had never returned to work. We were living in a charming village north of Bedford, and Maddie would often take Beth into Bedford for shopping, clinic visits, or to catch up with her former colleagues. We would occasionally meet for lunch when I was around, which was always pleasant. However, recently, Maddie had been coming home from these trips in a somber mood, clearly troubled by something. Maddie had shown signs of moodiness early in our relationship, shortly after we met through a mutual friend. This was likely due to her concerns about how quickly things were becoming serious between us, but she had seemed to move past that. I asked her about her concerns, but she only responded with a vague shake of her head. I considered the possibility of an affair, but since she always had Beth with her, that seemed unlikely. It turned out I was right in that assumption. But perhaps it would have been better if the issue were that simple. "What's wrong, Maddie?" I finally asked, more urgently when she seemed particularly despondent. She looked at me with a sad, lingering stare before speaking. "I owe you an explanation, James. You'll find out soon enough, so I might as well tell you now." "Find out what?" I asked, my anxiety growing. Was she ill? Was something wrong with our daughter? "Put Beth to bed first," she suggested with a sigh. "Then come down and we'll talk." "Okay." I took Beth upstairs, relieved that she was sleepy and didn't insist on a bedtime story. I was eager to return downstairs and learn what was troubling Maddie. If I had known what was coming, I might have stayed longer with Beth. If I had known, I might never have left her room. "Come and sit here, James," Maddie said, pointing to the chair on the opposite side of the table from where she was seated rather than next to her, which didn't seem very encouraging. "James, dear," she began, taking a deep breath before continuing, "you've asked about Tom several times, and I've never told you anything, have I?" "No," I replied. "You've always brushed me off." "Well, it's time I told you about Tom," Maddie said in a low voice. "Tom is a couple of years older than me, and when I was younger he was like an older brother after I went to live with him and his mother." "That sounds pretty normal," I said, trying to encourage her. "Yes, but as we grew older, things changed, James," Maddie continued, avoiding eye contact. "We weren't actually related, and we ended up, well, in a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship." I simply nodded, curious about where this conversation was heading and suspecting I wouldn't like it. As we reached our later teens, it became much more intense. "What did his mother think about that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and not dwell too much on what a much more intense might mean. "She was completely supportive. Tom was a bit of a wild boy, like his father had been before he died in a motorcycle accident. I haven't told you this before, but the reason our parents were so close was because they were all bikers, Hell's Angels, and all that." "Hell's Angels?" I exclaimed, taken aback. "Yes," Maddie confirmed. "All four of them. But your parents also died in a motorcycle accident, didn't they?" "Yes, they did," Maddie said sadly. "They were part of a large group heading to Brighton for the weekend when they took a corner too fast and crashed." "And Tom's dad?" I asked cautiously, already knowing about her parents, but surprised to learn there was more. "That was just 4 months later on his way to work. He ended up under a truck, and Auntie Beth lost her husband and 2 best friends in such a short time that she never got back on a bike. She came to hate them." "Well, that's understandable," I said sympathetically, given that I had never been fond of them myself. To me, anything with just 2 wheels was either a bicycle if it didn't have an engine, or the front or back half of a car if it did. "That's when Auntie Beth took me in and raised me as her own daughter," Maddie continued. "But she supported the idea of you and Tom getting together?" "Yes, she did," Maddie replied, her demeanor suggesting she was reminiscing about those days. "Tom was quite the rebel and was obsessed with motorbikes, riding them fearlessly just like his dad. Beth was worried about him, and I suppose she thought I might be a positive influence. And were you? Not really, Maddie sighed. In fact, quite the opposite. I ended up being just as wild as Tom. We were part of a biker gang and engaged in all sorts of activities we shouldn't have. A lot of them were against the law. Like speeding? I asked. Oh yes, that too, but there was much more. We developed quite a reputation with the local police. So, is that how Tom ended up in prison? I asked, still trying to process the fact that my sweet, innocent wife had once been involved in such a lifestyle. At least it might explain the tattoo on her bum that she was never eager to explain. Maddie hesitated before answering, seeming to gather the courage to share more. Sort of, she said eventually, and I waited for her to elaborate. We were out one night with the bike club, coming back from Manchester, when we stopped to meet another group we knew. Tom was on his new Honda with me on the back, and I was desperate to try it out. I didn't have a full bike license, though I had ridden his old Suzuki before, but I had never tried anything as powerful as his new bike. He wasn't keen on letting me ride it, which upset me. So, like a fool, I started flirting with another biker named Mike from the other gang. I knew he had always had a thing for me and had made advances a few times. Honestly, Mike and I had a bit of history when Tom wasn't around. We never went too far, but it was more than just kissing. I can hardly believe what I'm hearing, Maddie, I said, shocked. It was hard for me to imagine the mother of my child acting this way. It was years ago, James, she said with a remorseful look. I'm much older and wiser now. Are you sure you want me to continue? Yes, go on, Maddie, I encouraged her. This was all before I knew you. I'm surprised by all this, but it doesn't change how I feel about you. My wife sighed deeply again and gave me a sad smile, but stayed quiet otherwise. I had to motion for her to continue with her story. Well, Tom, bless him, got pretty jealous of how I was behaving, and things were getting a bit tense between the two groups. There was trouble brewing, but I, being the silly little thing I was, just kept enjoying the attention I was getting. Eventually, Tom came over and tried to pull me away from Mike, but I wasn't backing down. I told Mike that Tom was being mean and wouldn't let me try out his Honda, and asked if he would let me take a spin on his Kawasaki instead. It was a long shot since Mike's bike was even more powerful than the Honda, but he played along. He let you ride it? Number I said it was unlikely, but he wanted me to get on the back with him and go for a ride. A couple of their friends were sort of supporting them, but also trying to calm things down. But then Mike pushed things even further and said if I took off my top and rode on the back with him, he'd let me have a go afterwards. Top S, I exclaimed in disbelief. What made him think you'd agree to that? Because I'd done it before, James, several times. She shocked me. Only ever on the back with Tom, of course. But a few times at bike rallies, I'd gone around completely knack-D. It wasn't unusual in that crowd, and quite a few girls did it, showing off everything they had. I'm having a hard time digesting all this, Maddie, I said, shaking my head as my stomach clenched. It doesn't look like the girl I met and married. I've already told you, James, that I'm older and wiser now, but that was the case back then. Well, having fun? I suggested, and she nodded, trying to put on a weak smile. Tom didn't react in any way until I took off my leather jacket and t-shirt, and then I took off my bra. Then he grabbed me and yelled that if that's all it takes, I can ride his damn Honda. Would you take off your bra? I asked in disbelief. Her revelation shocked me, but I had to admit that I was more intrigued by her actions than the motorcycle story. The image of Maddie and a similar image was, well, it made a certain impression on me. You know what I mean, don't you? Yes, she replied simply. And would you show yourself to everyone? Yes. And ran away with him? I'm not sure, but probably. I was hoping Tom would give up first. Christ, Maddie, I muttered. You were really something back then, weren't you? I guess I was, she replied calmly. But you have to understand, in a crowd like that, guys were the kings, and girls were almost treated like possessions, both publicly and privately. When a girl got a chance to assert herself over a guy, it was a real thrill. I suppose that's one reason why there were so many fights over women. So he let you take the Honda for a spin, I asked, though honestly, I was still more curious about whether she'd taken her bra off by then. That was about to change, though. Yes, she continued. I put my jacket back on, gave Mike a kiss on the cheek to annoy Tom, and then went with him to his Honda. He was pretty mad at me, but still kept his promise. A few minutes later, I was cruising slowly around the parking lot with Tom on the back. I was loving it, and by then, I think even Tom was starting to enjoy it as I was handling it well. But then, everything went wrong. What happened? I asked, impatience evident in my voice. I must have really angered Mike too, because he followed us on his Kawasaki and started cutting me off. Tom got mad and told me to stop, but I thought I knew better and sped up. Mike left the parking lot and roared down the road, and despite Tom yelling at me, I chased after him. At this point, I noticed tears welling up in Maddie's eyes, and she seemed on the verge of crying. I moved closer and put my arm around her, telling her to take her time. But she shook her head and continued, beginning to sob as she finished her story. Mike sped up more and more, and like the idiot I was, I kept chasing him. It was exhilarating, and I ignored Tom shouting at me to stop and just kept going. At this point, Maddie broke down in tears, sobbing so uncontrollably that I could barely make out what she was saying. It took several more minutes before she could finish her story. By then, I had a strong sense that it wasn't going to have a happy ending, and I was right. Mike fell back and rode alongside us, urging me to go faster and faster, while Tom was going nuts in the back, hitting me on the back to slow down. But I didn't. I tried to pass Mike, but failed. I lost control. What happened, Maddie? I asked gently, holding her as she cried, clearly reliving a terrible experience. The Honda slid out from under me and crashed into Mike's bike. I don't remember what happened next, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital after being in a coma. I had a pretty bad head injury, but fortunately, Tom came out more or less unscathed. And what about this Mike character? I pressed. What happened to him, Maddie? Dead. Dead? Yes, dead. Shit. Exactly. But what happened next, sweetheart? I don't get it. You were riding the bike and Tom was just a passenger. How did he end up in prison? He took the blame, James, she sobbed. By the time I woke up and understood what was going on, it was too late. Tom told the police he was the one in the front seat and took the blame. But it wasn't him, Maddie, I said. It was you. I know. But why would he do that, sweetheart? I asked, searching for an explanation. Why would he take the blame? Because he loved me, she said simply. I was his woman, and he wanted to protect me. Shit. Exactly. By that point, both of us were done discussing it, and neither of us wanted to continue the conversation. So we settled on the sofa and stayed silent for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, I realized there was more to the story, and I needed to hear it all. What else do you need to tell me, Maddie? I finally asked. There must be more to Tom's actions than what you've shared so far. You're right, Maddie admitted. Believe it or not, at that time, Tom had a clean record with the police. He'd been pulled over a few times and had some speeding fines, but nothing serious. After the accident, Mike didn't seem too badly hurt, so Tom thought it wouldn't be a big deal and told the police he was driving. I, on the other hand, had a couple of convictions, and Tom was worried they'd come down hard on me. So, thinking it wasn't too serious, he took the blame. "You had 2 convictions?" I exclaimed, wondering what more there could be. "Good grief, Maddie. Were you a criminal or something?" "Not quite, James," Maddie said with a guilty grin. "I mentioned the kinds of things I used to do. Both convictions were for indecent exposure." "What?" "Riding around nude on the back of a bike at a campsite was one thing, but the cops didn't like us doing it through the middle of town." "Twice?" I asked. "More than twice," Maddie whispered. "I got caught 3 times, but they let me off the first time." I wasn't sure how much more I could handle, but she continued to explain that Mike's condition had suddenly worsened, and he unexpectedly passed away. Tom had stuck to his story to protect Maddie. Unfortunately, his case got mishandled in court, and he ended up with a much longer sentence than anticipated. "Sounds like you owe this Tom guy a lot, Maddie," I sighed when she finished speaking. "When is he getting out?" "That's the problem, James. He still has a few years left, but I just found out he's getting an early release for good behavior and will be out soon." "When?" "Thursday," she said, surprising me. "The day after tomorrow. That's why I've been so upset these past few weeks." Christ, what a mess. I put my head in my hands and thought for a moment. Maddie really owed this guy a lot, and despite my doubts, I knew I couldn't just ask her to abandon him after all he had done for her. I didn't like it at all, but she was my wife, I loved her, and I knew what had to be done. The poor guy, while he'd been locked up for something he didn't even do, his mother had died, and his girlfriend had married someone else. "I don't suppose he has anywhere to go when he gets out, does he?" I asked, silently hoping my assumption was wrong. "Not really," she replied, disappointing me. "His mom's house was only rented, and he's lost touch with his old friends up in Leeds." Wait a minute. I was missing something. "How do you know that, Maddie?" I asked. "How do you know so much about him if he's in prison up north somewhere?" "He's not up north, James," Maddie answered softly, barely audible. "He was, but he got into some fights up there and they transferred him." "Where to?" I asked, already knowing the answer before the words left my mouth. "Bedford," she mumbled. "Right here in Bedford prison." "Some bloody coincidence," I remarked sarcastically. "I'm sorry, James, honey. I know I should have told you a long time ago, but I kept putting it off, and it just became harder and harder to say anything. I felt trapped and didn't know how to get out of it." "So, your frequent trips into Bedford were to visit him, then?" "Not all the time, but—" She shrugged, unable to finish, as tears continued to roll down her cheeks. We stood there, staring at each other, unsure of what to say next. "I moved down here to be near him, James. I thought everything would work out, but I didn't expect to meet someone else. I didn't expect to meet you. I never planned on falling in love with another man." "What do we do now, Maddie?" "I don't know, James. As I mentioned earlier, I understood what needed to be done. I didn't even know the guy, but Maddie owed him a lot, and she was my wife. It was time to be generous." "Listen, Maddie," I began. "I don't like the idea, but I suppose he could stay here for a few days, long enough for him to find a place. Maybe we could even give him some money to help him get started." "We can't do that, James." "Why not?" I asked, somewhat relieved that she didn't think it was a good idea after all. "I don't think that would work for him, James." "Why the hell not?" I asked, feeling that my offer was pretty damn generous given the situation. "He doesn't know about you, James. He doesn't? Tom doesn't know I'm married, James. I'm so sorry, honey, but I never had the courage to tell him, and he still thinks I'm waiting for him to get out. I've really messed things up, haven't I?" "Oh, shit. Exactly," The rest of the evening was quite a disaster. We both tiptoed around each other, trying to figure out what to do. When we finally spoke again, I emphasized that she needed to tell Tom the truth on her next visit. The longer she waited, the harder it would be. I was really frustrated with her for being so reckless, especially since she was usually so organized and direct. But Maddie was my wife, and I loved her dearly. And of course, there was our daughter Beth to consider. Yes, Beth. That was the thing. I realized that Maddie still had strong feelings for Tom, even though I hadn't pressed her on it. But Maddie and I had Beth together, so I wasn't concerned about her long-term commitment. What I really wanted to do was demand that she tell this Tom guy to get lost, but deep down, I knew that would be a mistake. Maddie needed to work through this on her own, and my job was to help her do that. The next day, the day before Tom's release, Beth went to see him and tell him the truth. It wouldn't be easy, but it had to be done, so I took the day off to be there when she got back, knowing she would need my support. I waited at home, my stomach in knots, wondering what state she would be in when she returned. "Hi, Maddie," I greeted her at the door as she walked up the garden path. "How did it go? How did Tom take it?" "He didn't," she replied, somewhat cryptically, as she slipped past me. "What do you mean he didn't?" "I didn't tell him, James," Maddie said, not meeting my eyes. "He was so happy, like it was the best day of his life. I just couldn't do it, James. I couldn't break his heart when he was so happy." "For God's sake, Maddie," I snapped at her. "You think it's going to be any easier for him tomorrow? You think he's going to be any less upset? Grow up, you foolish woman." "I'm not going to tell him tomorrow, James," Maddie shot back. "I've made up my mind, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to give him a few days of happiness before I destroy him. It's the least I owe him, James, no matter what it costs me." I stood gaping while the full meaning of my wife's words came to me. "A few days of happiness?" I asked with concern in my voice. "Yes, James," she replied, finally meeting my gaze resolutely. "I have booked a hotel room in the city for tomorrow night, and I fully intend to repay Tom for everything he has done for me." "No way, Maddie," I shouted. "If you think I'm going to stand by while another man sleeps with my wife, then you're wrong. I know you owe him, but this is crazy." "You can't stop me, James," she shouted back. "This is my decision, my body, and I have to do what I think is right. I owe him a lot, James. Please try to understand." "I understand, okay? You're going to let another man sleep with you." "That's not going to happen, Maddie. It just can't happen. I've made my decision, James." "No way, Maddie." "I'll do it, James, dear. Why can't you understand?" "Then I might not be here when you get home, Maddie," I warned. "If you let him sleep with you, our marriage will be over." "I was hoping you'd be more understanding, James," she pleaded. "You know the situation I'm in and I have to do it. Please, James, try to understand." "There is nothing to understand here," I screamed in anger. "Then there's nothing to talk about," she shouted back. "Damn you, James, why can't you understand? I'm not taking anything away from you. Damn you too. If you do that, it's over between us." "Fuck you, you pathetic loser," she spat out, before storming out of the room, slamming the door behind her, leaving me standing there in confusion. And that was it. Later that evening, I tried to talk to her, but when it became clear that I wasn't going to give in, she just pulled away from me. I felt like I was ready to do something terrible, unable to believe that she didn't understand how she was destroying our relationship. What about Beth? Oh my God. What about poor Beth, whose life was on the verge of collapse? I woke up fairly early after spending the night in the spare bedroom. I got Beth up, dressed her, and made her breakfast. I had no intention of sticking around to witness Maddie's act of infidelity, so I planned to take Beth out for the day to avoid being there. It was another day off work, but I didn't care. "I'll see you sometime tomorrow, James," Maddie mumbled as she kissed and fussed over Beth while I was preparing to leave. "Maybe, maybe not," I replied gruffly, pushing her away when she tried to kiss me too. "Please don't be like this, James," she nearly sobbed. "Everything will be all right, honey. I promise." "It won't be all right, Maddie. Please reconsider." "What's wrong with Mommy?" Beth interrupted as her mother began to cry. "She's just being silly, sweetheart," I said, picking her up and walking out without another word. All things considered, my day with Beth wasn't too bad. It began with a trip to the Whipsnade Zoo and ended, somewhat predictably, at McDonald's. I realized that I really should spend more time taking my daughter out, though the idea of possibly doing it alone in the future didn't exactly appeal to me. I really tried to understand Maddie's perspective and could see how difficult it was for her. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't agree with her actions. Then I attempted to put myself in Tom's shoes and found myself struggling there as well. Poor guy had ended up in prison for loving a woman, and what had she done to him? What a bloody mess. "When will Mommy be home, Daddy?" my little daughter asked when we got back. "She's gone away for the night, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep the mood light. "She'll be back soon." "Who did she go with, Daddy?" "Just a friend," I replied, not wanting to elaborate. "Is it Tom?" She shocked me with that question, as it never crossed my mind that my daughter would know anything about him. "How do you know about Tom?" I asked nervously. "Mommy and I visit him when we go to Bedford, Daddy. It's not a very nice place where he lives, but Mommy says he can't come live with us because the men there say he has to stay where he is." I looked at my little daughter in disbelief. What kind of person was my loving wife turning out to be behind my back? Not only had she deceived both Tom and me, but she had also taken our daughter, my daughter, to see that bastard in prison. I was beginning to wonder if I knew my wife at all. "Mommy said that Tom would be getting out soon, Daddy," Beth continued. "What does getting out mean?" "It means he won't have to live in that nasty place anymore, sweetheart," I said, without thinking. "Oh, good," she replied. "Tom is really nice. Will he be able to come live with us then?" "I don't think so, Beth," I responded sadly. "I just don't think that would be possible." That evening was terrible, and I just didn't have the strength to put my daughter to bed. It was one of those rare occasions when she actually had to tell me that she was tired and wanted to sleep. Eventually, she fell asleep in my arms, and I held her for a while, before finally giving up and carrying her to the bedroom, dreading the thought of having to spend the rest of the evening alone. The phone call, of course, did not help. "Hi, honey," Maddie greeted me when I reluctantly picked up the phone. "What do you want?" I asked sharply. "Please don't be like that, James," she begged. "I'm just calling to make sure you're both okay." "Beth is fine," I told her. "She's in bed." "What about you, James?" Maddie asked quietly. "Are you okay?" "Has he slept with you yet?" I asked angrily, ignoring her question. "Please, James, has he slept with you yet?" I repeated even louder, interrupting her. "James, answer the damn question," I yelled at her. "Yes, he slept with me," Maddie blurted back, and her tone matched my anger. "He's already slept with me twice, and he'll do it again when he gets back." "Well, I hope you enjoyed it, you lying wife." "I liked it," she shouted back at me, losing her temper. "He's better than you in bed." A heavy silence followed her words, and I recoiled, stunned by what she had said. I think it dawned on her, too, the weight of her words. "James, sweetheart," she called out in desperation after a few moments. "I didn't mean that, I promise." I didn't catch how she finished that sentence. My pride was shattered. and my heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. Slowly and deliberately, I placed the phone back on the cradle and stood there, staring at it as tears welled up in my eyes. Naturally, it started ringing again just seconds later, but I yanked the cord out of the socket. When my mobile phone began to beep a minute later, I scrambled to turn it off, but when I couldn't, I hurled it against the wall with all my strength. It stopped beeping as it shattered, and I stood there in the silence, tears now streaming down my face. I stood there and sobbed while my wife waited for her lover to return to her. Sobbed as the crushing loneliness consumed me, hating the world and nearly everything in it. I must have stood there for over an hour, half wondering and, to be honest, half hoping that Maddie would show up and somehow make everything right. But deep down, I knew that was impossible, and of course she didn't return. It wasn't until I thought of my little Beth that I began to pull myself together, realizing that I needed to be strong for her. She was all that mattered to me, and that gave me the strength to keep going. I made myself a cup of tea, the universal remedy, and sat there, reflecting on how my life was about to change. Would I take Maddie back? What a question. Every part of me screamed no, but my heart whispered something different, in a language I could barely comprehend. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to be strong for Beth. I would do whatever it took to keep her with me, no matter what Maddie tried. I even found myself thinking that I'd take Maddie back for Beth's sake. But who was I fooling? I wanted Maddie back for myself, despite everything she'd done, but I knew things would never be the same. It wouldn't work, and it wasn't going to happen. And as I thought about the upheaval that was about to impact the innocent little girl sleeping soundly upstairs, unaware of the chaos around her, I felt tears welling up again. Damn you, Maddie. Why did you have to do this to the people who love you? The next morning, I woke up to something brushing against my face. Wake up, Daddy, I heard through the fog in my mind. Why didn't you go to bed last night? Good morning, sweetheart, I replied groggily. I just dozed off on the sofa and forgot to go to bed. Silly Daddy, Beth giggled. Mummy's gonna think you're silly when I tell her. I think Mummy already thinks I'm a bit of a fool, I sighed, as the weight of everything settled back on my weary shoulders. Daddy took the day off work to look after you again. Where would you like to go? Can we go to the zoo, please, Daddy? My little one asked excitedly, clapping her hands. But we went there yesterday, honey, I reminded her. But I want to go again, Daddy, she giggled. I want to see the big elephants, and the funny monkeys, and what do they call those big ones with the long, funny necks, Daddy? Giraffes, sweetheart, I told her. But you saw them all yesterday. How about we go to Old Warden and see the old airplanes? Do they have lions and tigers and things there? No, Beth, they don't, I explained, feeling a bit eager for a visit to the old airplane museum I hadn't been to in years, hoping it might distract me. But they do have lots of other interesting things. Do they have a McDonald's there, Daddy? I told her they probably didn't, but we could find one on the way home. That pretty much settled it. Yes. Half an hour later, we were on our way back to the zoo. It was a good day, and for several hours I managed to set aside my troubles and enjoy time with my daughter. Maybe she'd become a vet when she grew up. Everything was fine until we left McDonald's, stuffed with triple burgers and frothy milkshakes, when the dark thoughts started to creep back in. How on earth did I mess everything up? How could I let our marriage fall apart and risk ruining little Beth's life? Perhaps Maddie and I could move past her mistake, and in a few years, the issues with Tom would just be a distant memory. Maybe. By the time we got home, Beth was ready for bed, so we cuddled on the sofa again, and for the second night in a row, I carried her sleeping upstairs. So far, so good, but then I had to wait alone to see what time Maddie would come back. We hadn't discussed it, so I had no idea when she'd return. Damn it. All we've done is scream at each other since she announced her plans. I promised myself that when she did come home, I'd keep my temper in check and try to have a rational conversation. Deep down, I could somewhat understand why she felt she needed to do what she did, but she had to see things from my perspective too. I had serious doubts about whether we could overcome what I saw as her betrayal, but for Beth's sake, I was willing to try. If Maddie was too. I waited until 9 o'clock, somehow convinced she'd be back by then. Then I waited until 10 and started getting really angry again. At 20 past 10, the phone, which had just been reconnected, rang. "Hello, James Dawson speaking," I answered cautiously. "Are you in a better mood than you were last night, James?" demanded the voice on the other end. "Not much, Maddie," I replied. "When are you coming home?" "That depends on you, James," she said, instantly reminding me of the day she first told me she was pregnant with Beth. "If I come back in the morning, are you going to talk to me calmly and not yell at me?" "Tomorrow morning?" I shot back. "You're supposed to come home tonight." "The plans changed, James," she announced. "So, are you going to be reasonable about this or not?" I counted to 5 to control my temper before replying. "Have you told him yet?" I asked, ignoring her question. "Does he know we're married?" "Yes, James, he does." "And?" "He took it quite well, all things considered," Maddie informed me, as if she were talking about someone being dropped from the local football team. "He handled it a lot better than you did." "Oh, really?" I responded, struggling to keep from yelling at her. "And where exactly were the two of you when he took the news so well?" Silence. "And what exactly were the two of you doing when you broke the news to him, Maddie?" I continued. "Or had you already finished?" Still no response. "I'll see you when you get home, Maddie," I said to the silent phone. "Then we'll decide whether this is still your home or not." I heard a click as Maddie hung up on me. I got Beth up in the morning, made her favorite breakfast, and took her to her usual Saturday morning dance class. While there, I arranged for another mom to pick her up and watch her for a while, in case I didn't return in time. "Maddie usually picks her up, but she's been away for a couple of nights," I explained, wondering how long it would be before the truth came out. "That's fine," the other mom reassured me. "Beth can stay with us all day if you need some time to catch up with Maddie." "Thanks," I replied. I think I managed to smile, but I'm not entirely sure. 15 minutes later, I returned home, my heart skipping a beat, when I saw Maddie's car already parked in its usual spot outside. This wasn't how I wanted things to go, but at this point, what difference did it make? Maddie asked sharply as I closed the door. "What do you think?" I answered, briefly. "You didn't do anything stupid, did you, James?" She almost blamed me. "It depends on whether it would be considered stupid to take her to dance lessons." Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, I forgot," Maddie muttered, clearly embarrassed. "Okay, the first round is up to me, but there's still a long way to go." "Listen, James," she began again. "Tom really understood the whole mess and made me realize that I was being unfair to you. If we could just sit down and discuss everything, we both believe that we can come up with something that will suit the three of us." "I suppose you mean all four of us, Maddie," I said. "Have you forgotten about Beth?" "Yes, of course, James," Maddie quickly added. "I mean all four of us." So, the second round is up to me. I was gaining points, but the future still looked bleak. I motioned for her to continue. "The thing is, James, I really love you and always will. But now that Tom is back, everything has changed, hasn't it?" "How do you like it?" "I don't think I've ever stopped loving him, James," my wife explained. "I'm so sorry, James, but I'm in love with two men." "The problem is," I reminded her, that the second one is better than me in bed. James, she exclaimed, I didn't want to say that. I was angry and lost my temper, and I didn't want that. But it's true, isn't it? So what? Maddie sobbed. What does it matter? I have never complained about you, and I will never complain. You're damn right you'll never complain, I retorted. You will never understand this, because you will no longer have the opportunity to compare us. Please, James, she continued desperately, not giving up. Please just listen to what Tom and I have come to. Please, James. I shrugged, half agreeing to listen as she continued more confidently. Tom and I thought we could come to some kind of agreement between the three of us. I could continue to live here with you and Beth, so we'd be like a little family, and Tom would find a place nearby. I suppose you could visit him? I asked incredulously. Yes, of course, but I'd spend most nights here with you, James. But you spend half the nights with him, I objected. It's not a monster, James, and it's not going to last half the night, Maddie muttered, realizing that everything was going awry. Do you really expect me to agree with that, Maddie? I asked quietly. You get the best of both worlds. Tom gets freedom with the constant offer of intimacy, and I become a cuckold, probably supporting all of us. I don't think so, she whispered. No, when you put it that way. I'll tell you what, Maddie, I began. Call Tom right now and tell him to get back to Leeds, and maybe, just maybe, I'll take you back. That doesn't sound very promising, James, Maddie replied sadly. That's all I can do, Maddie, I said firmly, still not sure if I wanted her to accept it. I think I'll have to decline, James. Close the door behind you when you leave, okay? I thought that was the end of it. What about Beth? Asked Maddie. She'll have to live with me and Tom. Over my dead body, Maddie, I replied angrily. I would have done anything to prevent it. Let's see, James. Maddie smiled at me. If you think you can keep Beth, then there are surprises waiting for you. To hell with you, Maddie, I spat in her direction with hatred. Go back to your jailer lover. No court in the world will grant you custody while you're with this loser. Maddie didn't say anything else, just got up, walked out, and left. Oh yes, and she did slam the front door. She almost blew it off its hinges. A game, a set, and a match for me? I didn't think so. In fact, I had a terrible feeling that the game had just begun. I didn't hear from either of them for the next 4 or 5 days. It felt like sitting in the trenches during World War I, waiting for the next barrage or major assault to overwhelm me. I took the opportunity to visit Tim, a friend of mine who also happened to be my lawyer, only to leave with my confidence in securing custody of Beth somewhat shattered. 50-50, he told me grimly. If she can prove she's in a stable relationship, the court might side with her. But he's a bloody convict, I protested. He actually murdered someone. That wasn't true, of course, but even Tim didn't know that. He killed someone in an accident, James, my friend corrected me. He's paid his debt to society and has the same rights as anyone else. What's he like? Does he seem a bit shady or anything? Is there anything we can use against him? I have no idea, I had to admit. I've never met him, never even seen him. Maybe you should, James. All this time, I had been showering Beth with kindness and attention, finding countless excuses for why her beloved mother wasn't around. Daddy, when is Mummy coming home? She asked drowsily. Soon, sweetheart, I replied, still unable to bring myself to tell her the truth. I miss Mummy. So do I, sweetheart, I answered, tears welling up in my eyes as I held her tightly. And I did. Oh God, how I miss that woman. I was set to meet this Tom character more easily, and perhaps sooner than I had anticipated when I received a call from my friend, asking me to attend a meeting with the other parties, as he put it, and their solicitor. I put on a brave face as I walked into the meeting, surprised to see what this Tom fellow actually looked like. Come on now, a biker guy, a Hell's Angel and all that. I had expected Tom to be some greasy, long-haired layabout. But the tall, clean-cut, fair-haired, somewhat slim and athletic man who greeted me took me by surprise. "Hello, James," he said nervously, extending his hand for a handshake. "Sorry we have to meet like this. In fact, I'm sorry about the whole damn thing." Damn it. I really wanted to hate the guy, but I found myself shaking his hand. At least I didn't smile too much, and maybe this wouldn't be as difficult as I had feared. Oh, how wrong I was. "Mr. Dawson," their solicitor, an overweight, smug-looking bastard, began the proceedings. "It's clear your wife has no intention of taking you back, so there's no point in pursuing that path." Tim, my solicitor, held out his hand to stop me from taking a swing at the jerk and took up the challenge. "I don't think my client is interested in that possibility either," he countered. "As far as we're concerned, it's just a matter of determining my client's access to the daughter of the marriage. Obviously, my client will be the primary caregiver, and she will live with him, but he is willing to grant reasonable access to his soon-to-be ex-wife." "Not so fast," the fat man replied with a smile that would put a crocodile to shame. My clients have a stronger claim to the child." "That's nonsense," I shouted, but Tim motioned for me to calm down again. "The fact that my client, Mrs. Dawson, is the child's mother is not in dispute," the fat man continued. "Are we agreed on that?" Tim acknowledged the situation, giving me a puzzled look, just as confused as I was by the other guy's approach. "Then we also need to establish the paternity," the jerk continued, and this time Tim had to physically hold me back from confronting the asshole. "My clients assert that Mr. Dawson is not the father of the child, but rather her former boyfriend, Mr. Thomas Wellings is." "Tom? Tom is Beth's father? What kind of nonsense is that?" I was so shocked that I just sat there, mouth agape. "We have documented proof, including medical evidence, showing that Mr. Wellings is 99.9% likely to be the child's biological father. We also have supporting evidence that your client, Mr. Dawson, couldn't possibly be the father." "What nonsense are you spouting?" I shouted at the fat bastard. "Beth is my daughter. I was there when she was born, and I've raised her. Apparently not, Mr. Dawson," Fatty interrupted. "You may have raised her as your daughter, but you are not her biological father. My client, Mr. Wellings, is—" "But that's impossible," I protested. "He was in prison when Maddie got pregnant. I was there when she was born, for God's sake. It's just not possible." "My clients have explained, Mr. Dawson," he continued in a flat tone. "Apparently, you were in Canada when Mr. Wellings' mother passed away, and he was granted compassionate leave from prison to attend the funeral. My client, Mrs. Dawson, who was then Miss Jones, also attended the funeral, and let's just say they had the opportunity to reconnect." The room started spinning as I absorbed what he was telling me. It was hard to believe, but deep down I knew it could be true. I was dark and somewhat stocky, while Beth was growing up tall, slim, and fair-haired, just like her father. Oh no. As the room spun around me, Maddie burst into tears and ran out. Tom stood up to follow her, but hesitated. "I'm sorry, James," he said. "I swear Maddie didn't know you weren't Beth's father until she started to resemble me." "Does that make it right?" I shouted. "Does that justify her sleeping with you when she was practically engaged to me?" "No," he admitted quietly, shaking his head. "Maddie has no excuse for what she did, but I love her. I always have. And, oh hell, James, I'm just so sorry." With that, he turned on his heels and followed Maddie out of the office. "Well, Mr. Dawson," the overweight lawyer chimed in again, "can we reach an agreement here? I have a busy day, so let's come to some suitable terms, perhaps. Before I could respond, Tim jumped to his feet and yelled at the other lawyer. "Shut up, you miserable jerk. Say one more word and I swear I'll smash your nose through the other side of your face." "Not very professional," the fat man remarked snidely, but he stood up, gathered his papers, and quickly shuffled out of the office. "You'll be hearing from me." "Sorry, James." My friend and personal lawyer sighed once the other man had left. "I didn't see that coming." "No, neither did I. My story doesn't end there, but it's worth mentioning that the last glimpse I had of Maddie was as she rushed out of that office. If I had known that then, maybe my actions in the following days would have been different, but looking back, perhaps not. Tim called his secretary and instructed her to cancel everything for the rest of the day. Despite her objections, he practically whisked me away, dragging me in a daze to the nearest pub. There, we downed the first 3 pints as quickly as we ordered them, and over the next hour or so, 5 or 6 of my closest friends mysteriously showed up to join me in drinking myself into oblivion. I can't remember how the evening ended or even leaving the pub. I don't recall much of the next day either. My first clear thought was waking up the following morning in a strange bed with an equally strange but very attractive woman curled up next to me. I never fully figured out what the arrangement was, but if anyone paid her, it certainly wasn't me. Either way, she disappeared, and I never saw her again. Or maybe I did, but unless she was nakty with a rose tattoo in a rather intimate place, I wouldn't have recognized her if she'd been standing right in front of me. I suppose that's what good friends are for. I won't pretend that I fell into a deep depression and withdrew from the world. I'm the kind of guy who sees his beer glass as half full rather than half empty, and with that positive outlook, I set out to rebuild my life. Sure, the black cloud was there, but I gave it my best shot. I dated anyone who came my way, pretty or not, but found myself gravitating toward women with children, single mothers, or divorcees. As you can imagine, this made me quite popular, and I got my fair share of attention. However, the only one I started to develop feelings for ended up dumping me, accusing me of being interested only in her daughter. That's right. I was trying, perhaps too hard, to replace my daughter Beth. I was searching for a partner with a Beth substitute. Crazy? Yes, I know. But that's how it affected me. Eventually, I recognized my problem and tried to manage it. It reduced the number of women I dated, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. You might reasonably ask, what about Beth herself? Yes, I insisted on seeing her even though we weren't biologically related, but that turned out to be a complete disaster. Maddie and Tom had moved back to Leeds, so I had to travel there one weekend to visit Beth. To be fair, neither Maddie nor Tom objected. In fact, they did everything they could to make my trip easier. It was Tom I spoke to whenever I called, and it was Tom who greeted me when I arrived to pick up Beth. Maddie, perhaps wisely, had made herself scarce, but it didn't go well. Beth was so confused and spent the entire day trying to convince me to come live with them, not able to grasp at her young age just how impossible that was. She kept insisting, unable to accept that Daddy didn't love Mommy anymore, repeatedly telling me how nice Daddy Tom was and how happy I would be there. When I took her back, she started crying as she realized I was about to leave. She clung to me, sobbing and throwing a tantrum. In the end, Tom had to pull her away from me and hold her while I ran out of the house, my tears mirroring Beth's. It was heartbreaking, perhaps more so than before. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but I vowed then and there that there would be no more visits. I couldn't put little Beth through that pain again, and I didn't think I could endure it either. When I told Tom of my decision, he tried to get me to reconsider, saying they'd do everything possible to make it less traumatic next time. But deep down, we both knew this was for the best. We eventually agreed to give it 6 months to allow Beth to settle into her new life, and then we'd see. We agreed on that, but we both knew what it really meant. For her sake, I would no longer be a part of her life. Maybe when she grew up, I promised myself. Maybe when she graduated or something. I made all sorts of promises to myself, but the reality was that I was completely on my own again, with memories of my wife and daughter being just that. Memories. I'll always be thankful that I wasn't prone to suicidal thoughts. Life continued its course, as it tends to do, and the sharpness of my painful memories gradually dulled. Time, they say, is a great healer, but I can assure you it's no miracle cure. It takes effort, and I put in that effort, slowly rebuilding a new life for myself. When the first Christmas came around, I couldn't let it pass without doing something. I bought a gift for Beth and sent it off, unsure of how to sign it or reveal who it was from, not wanting to reopen old wounds. To my surprise, a week after Christmas, I received a letter from Leeds. Yes, Beth had written me a short note of thanks and shared some details about her life. It was clear an adult had helped her, and I had a strong feeling that person was Tom, not my ex-wife. I wondered if she even knew the letter had been sent, but I didn't dwell on that thought. In the letter, she called me Daddy James. I knew this meant I had been replaced, and that Daddy was now likely Tom. But it actually brought me a lot of comfort, knowing that Beth had 2 parents who loved her, and that she would perhaps always remember me by that name. Daddy James. I continued to send her presents every birthday and Christmas, and I kept receiving thank you letters from her along with photographs. With pride, I noticed how her handwriting improved over the next couple of years. Often, Tom would include a little note himself, just to update me on how well she was doing at school, in dance lessons, or whatever else, but there was never any mention of me visiting again. I might have secretly hoped that we would meet again soon, but after about a year, Beth mentioned her little baby brother in one of her letters, and I realized that I shouldn't try to involve myself any further. Tom and Maddie then had 2 children, and I was no longer a part of that family. Not surprisingly, my friend Tim's wife had a friend. Well, she had quite a few friends, of course, but you know what I mean. Her name was Sally. She was a solicitor, a few years younger than me, with dark hair and a slim figure, and she had the most incredible legs I'd ever seen. The fact that I'm even mentioning her here obviously means that Sally became someone special. As so many of our interests aligned, it felt like we were always meant to be. Eventually, I popped the question. We were both divorced, gainfully employed, and simply in love. And yes, the intimacy was pretty damn good too, in case you were wondering. "Oh, James," she responded with a big smile on her face. "I'd love to, but there was a but. Unspoken, but definitely a but." "What's wrong, Sally?" I asked, genuinely surprised there could be a but. "I know your history, James," she replied softly. "You'll want children, won't you?" "Of course I will, Sally." I grinned back. "At least 2, maybe more." "But I can't have children, James," she said, shocking me. "That's why my last marriage ended. My ex was desperate for a son to carry on his family name." "You never told me that," I whispered, recalling that her ex-husband David was some kind of minor baronet, which would explain the importance of a son. "Whose fault was it?" "Oh, mine, James. We were tested, and David was fine, but my eggs weren't quite what they should be. Not impossible, but not very likely." "And he ended your marriage just because of that?" I asked, surprised. David always seemed like such a nice, reasonable guy whenever I met him. "No, it wasn't just that," Sally answered sadly. "But that issue led to arguments and eventually to our divorce." "I'm so sorry, Sally. I had no idea. Couldn't you have adopted or something?" I would have, but David's family was strongly against it, and in the end, it drove a wedge between us. That's sad, I commented. Very sad, she agreed. But then I wouldn't have met you, would I? So, you will marry me then? I asked her directly. The conversation continued, with Sally worrying that she didn't want another marriage to fail for the same reason, and me trying to reassure her that I would accept it. We discussed the possibilities of adoption or other artificial methods, which Sally, given her past experience, knew much more about than I did. The truth is, there were a lot of things to consider, and neither of us were getting any younger. Why don't you ask me again in 3 months? Sally finally suggested. That will give you time to think it over. How about I keep the question open, and you give me your answer in 3 months? I responded. Or sooner, if you're ready. And that's where we left it. I wanted her to say yes, but deep down, I had to acknowledge my own doubts. I really, really wanted a child. Actually, more than one. And the thought of adoption and everything that comes with it left me feeling a bit uncertain. Unfortunately, that uncertainty started creating small cracks in our relationship. Cracks that hadn't been there before and didn't need to be. There was no question of us breaking up or anything. We were still very happy together. But the doubts were there, and the topic of marriage quietly moved to the back burner. They say every cloud has a silver lining. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. That morning, I certainly wasn't thinking about clouds as I sat in my office, trying to figure out how to justify a significant expense on a new project I was leading. The last thing I needed was a phone call to break my train of thought, especially one unrelated to my project. "Mr. Dawson?" asked a voice that was both unfamiliar and rather officious. "Mr. James Dawson?" "Yes, that's me," I replied casually, still focused on making $250,000 seem like pocket change. "I need to ask you a couple of security questions, Mr. Dawson." "Fine," I answered, slightly irritated by the interruption. "But first, who are you?" "Apologies," the voice responded, not sounding apologetic at all. "My name is Mrs. Murphy from Headingley Social Services. Headingley is a suburb of Leeds." "I know where Headingley is, Mrs. Murphy," I said, my interest suddenly piqued. "What can I do for you?" "Are you Mr. James Edward Dawson?" "Yes, that's me." "And you were previously married to Mrs. Madeline Dawson, who later became Mrs. Wellings?" "Yes, that's me," I repeated, starting to get a bit annoyed with her formal tone. "For security purposes, could you tell me your ex-wife's middle name, please?" "Jean," I replied. She seemed satisfied with that, and then asked me for her date of birth, which I correctly answered once again. "What's going on here?" I demanded more firmly. "Headingley Social Security Services are tasked with resolving some outstanding issues concerning the late Mrs. Wellings." "The late Mrs. Dawson?" I asked, suddenly realizing it must have been Tom's mother. "But she passed away several years ago, and I never met her. What could this possibly have to do with me?" "On the contrary, Mr. Dawson," the voice responded. "Mrs. Wellings died 6 days ago in a motorbike accident along with her husband." "What? That's impossible. They... My voice trailed off as the reality of her words hit me. I almost dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dawson," the Social Security lady continued. "I assumed you would have known." "What about Beth?" I cried out as the terrible possibilities flooded my mind. "She's okay, isn't she? Please tell me she's all right." "She's quite upset, sir," the woman replied, with a faint hint of empathy for the first time. "She wasn't involved in the accident, but she's understandably very distressed. She's been asking for you, but it took us a few days to locate you." "Where is she?" I almost shouted into the phone. "I'm leaving now. I'll come and get her." The woman gave me the address, and within 5 minutes, I was in my car, leaving the parking lot, my supposedly important project completely forgotten. I was incredibly anxious as I sat in Mrs. Murphy's somewhat gloomy office, having finally convinced her of my identity and my unwavering desire to have Beth with me. To my surprise, I discovered that Tom and Maddie had done nothing to alter the situation, and of course, I hadn't heard a word about any adoption request. Legally, I was still Beth's father, as it was clearly stated on her birth certificate. Imagine that. I suppose I felt some sadness upon hearing about Maddie and Tom's passing, despite everything Maddie had done to me. But the overwhelming excitement of seeing Beth again had overshadowed any other emotions. But there was something else I hadn't considered. Finally, there was a knock on the door, and another woman entered the room, holding Beth's hand. My Beth. The first time I had seen her in nearly 4 years. "Daddy, is that really you?" Beth asked, her voice hesitant. Understandably so, since, although I had received photos of her, she hadn't seen me since she was 4 years old. "Yes, it's me, sweetheart," I managed to say, my voice choked with emotion as a single tear rolled down my cheek. I held my arms out to her. "Daddy, Daddy," she cried as she ran towards me. "I missed you. I knew you'd come for me." I had mentioned earlier that there was something I'd completely forgotten, and it hit me as I held my daughter in my arms. When I tried to lift Beth, I noticed something felt off. Glancing down, I was surprised to see a little boy clinging tightly to Beth's skirt. Oh no, I had forgotten. Beth had a little brother. "This is Jimmy," Beth introduced me after I set her down, not wanting to upset the poor boy by winning the tug of war. Even so, the little guy looked on the verge of tears. He seemed about 3 years old, a sturdy little fellow with dark hair, looking like a future rugby player. Clearly terrified, he held on bravely, unsure of what was to come. "Hello, Jimmy." I smiled at him reassuringly, but he just stared back, still uncertain. "Daddy James used to be your real daddy?" he asked Beth, keeping his eyes on me. "Yes, Jimmy," she replied. "Mummy and Daddy always told us how nice he was, and now he's going to be our daddy and take us to live with him." Mrs. Murphy opened her mouth to speak, likely to correct that innocent statement since nothing had been discussed about Jimmy, but I raised my hand to stop her, and she wisely remained silent. "My mummy and daddy have gone to heaven," little Jimmy said. "Will you really be our new daddy?" "How old are you, Jimmy?" I asked, suddenly struck by a thought as I looked at him. "3, he replied. "3 and... He then looked up at his older sister for help. "He's 3 and 4 months, Beth finished for him. "His birthday is on the 7th of November. "Well, I'll be damned," I exclaimed as the truth dawned on me. The math was easy. 3 years and 4 months, plus another 9 months, took us back to mid-October. Yes, over a month before Tom was released from prison 4 years ago. And with Jimmy's build and complexion, there was no doubt in my mind. Jimmy was my son. For heaven's sake, they must have known, and even named him Jimmy after me. No wonder Maddie hadn't been there the one time I visited. She must have been showing by then. "Come and give your dad a hug, little man." I grinned at him, a warm feeling spreading through me. He hesitated for a moment before leaping into my arms, followed closely by Beth, and the 3 of us hugged and cried, oblivious to everyone around us. After that, everything went smoothly. I had the legal right to take Beth with me, and in just 10 minutes before a hastily arranged judge, I was also granted the right to take Jimmy. Of course, there would be paperwork to handle later, but I knew of a certain solicitor who I hoped would be happy to help with that. "This is my friend, Sally." I introduced the kids the very next day, noticing that her eyes were already starting to well up. "Are you going to be our new mommy?" little Jimmy asked. "Hush, Jimmy. Beth scolded her brother. Daddy said she's a friend of his. Sally looked at the two of them for a few moments before saying anything, while I held my breath. It's all right, Beth, she finally said, tears streaming down her face. If your daddy still wants me, then I believe you two are the answer to our prayers, and I'd love to be your new mommy. Well, the offer was still on the table, and the 3 months hadn't passed yet, so you can guess how it all turned out. That afternoon, Sally and I took the kids out for the day. We held hands, ran together, played together, laughed together, and shared in the experience. Yes, that's right, we ended up going to the zoo again. In the months and years that followed, there were certainly challenging times as my 2 children remembered Tom and Maddie, who had been their parents. However, time does heal, and those difficult moments passed as our children grew up and Sally and I began to happily age together. Beth became a veterinarian and is joyfully married to a young civil engineer, and we're eagerly anticipating our first grandchildren. Jimmy joined the Royal Air Force and has recently earned his wings. I wonder if his passion for airplanes came from the many times we dragged each other to Old Warden to visit the museum there.